In 1938, in the heat and dust of Texas oil country, a contract was signed that would change the global energy map for decades. But here's the twist. Its most important clause, the one that created a multi-billion-dollar oil empire, wasn't the product of brilliant legal maneuvering or a ruthless negotiation. It was the result of a single typo, a slip of the pen, and it went unnoticed until it was far too late to reverse. Let's wind the clock back to late 1930s America. The Great Depression had battered the economy, but one sector still held the promise of staggering wealth: oil. Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana were dotted with wooden derricks, and the smell of crude hung in the air. In those days, oil exploration was a dangerous gamble. You could spend years drilling dry wells and walk away bankrupt, but if you struck a rich field, your fortune was made overnight. Into this high-stakes world stepped two men whose names at the time were barely known outside their local counties: H.L. Hunt, a Texas oilman with a gambler's instinct, and a smaller independent operator named Marion Monty Kirkwood. Hunt had already built a modest fortune in East Texas but was looking westward, toward the Permian Basin, a geological formation in West Texas and southeastern New Mexico that geologists whispered might hold unimaginable reserves. The only problem? Large tracts of promising land were already leased by a patchwork of small companies and individual prospectors. One such tract near the town of Kermit, Texas, belonged to Kirkwood. He had drilled 2 shallow wells without luck and was running out of capital. Hunt, smelling opportunity, approached Kirkwood in the summer of 1938 with a proposal. Hunt's company would take over exploration and production on the land in exchange for a share of the profits if oil was found. That's when the lawyers got involved. The standard oil lease in those days usually granted the landowner or existing leaseholder a royalty of 1/8, 12.5% of the gross oil revenue. But the draft contract that Hunt's attorney prepared was typed up in a rush, using a reused template from a previous deal. In the crucial royalty clause, the typist accidentally wrote 1/8 of 1/8, effectively 1/64, or just 1.5625%, instead of the standard 1/8. On paper, it looked almost the same, buried in dense legal text, but the difference in financial terms was astronomical. Here's where the domino effect begins. Kirkwood, exhausted from months of financial stress, skimmed the contract and focused on the upfront payment Hunt was offering, a modest but immediate cash lifeline. He initialed each page without catching the error. Hunt himself, according to later accounts, didn't notice it either at the signing. The contract was executed in September 1938 and filed with the county clerk. 3 months later, in December, Hunt's drilling crews hit a gusher, an oil strike so massive that local newspapers claimed it was the well that could light every home in Texas for a year. Within weeks, the field was producing thousands of barrels a day. Oil prices in the late 1930s were around $1.10 a barrel. In today's money, that was still a respectable sum. Kirkwood, expecting a comfortable royalty check, was stunned when the first payment arrived, barely a fraction of what he had calculated. When he contacted Hunt's office, the answer was blunt. The contract specified 1/64th. It was legal, binding, and filed with the county. Kirkwood hired a lawyer to challenge the agreement, arguing mutual mistake. But Texas contract law was, and still is, notoriously strict when it comes to signed agreements. Unless you could prove fraud, which was difficult without evidence that Hunt knew about the error, the wording stood. By the time the case reached a preliminary hearing in early 1939, Hunt's operation had already expanded across the tract, securing adjacent leases. The judge, citing the plain language of the contract, dismissed Kirkwood's claim. The oil kept flowing, and so did the money, almost all of it into Hunt's coffers. Over the next decade, the revenue from that single field became the foundation of Hunt Oil Company, which would grow into one of the largest privately held oil companies in the world. The royalties that should have supported Kirkwood's family for generations barely covered his legal bills. Now here's where the story takes on an almost cinematic irony. Industry insiders would later point out that if Kirkwood had received the standard royalty, he could have reinvested in other leases during the wartime oil boom of the 1940s, potentially becoming a major player himself. Instead, the imbalance created by a single typo set two men on drastically different paths, one toward immense wealth and political influence, the other toward obscurity. The ripple effects didn't stop there. The revenue from that field allowed Hunt to fund massive expansions into offshore drilling in the Gulf of Mexico, as well as early ventures into international oil markets. In the 1950s and 60s, Hunt Oil became a key player in U.S. energy policy discussions, using its clout to influence legislation on drilling rights and export controls. Some historians even argue that the company's rise helped shift the balance of power within the Texas oil industry away from the old Standard Oil-descended majors toward a new breed of independent giants, giants whose political connections would shape everything from domestic fuel prices to America's posture in the Middle East. And all of that because one late summer afternoon in 1938, a tired typist hit the wrong key, and no one caught it before the ink dried. The deeper you follow this trail, the more you realize how a small clerical slip cascaded into a realignment of economic and political power. By the mid-1950s, H.L. Hunt's fortune, seeded by that one mistyped fraction, had grown to the point where he was considered the richest man in the United States, with estimated assets surpassing $1 billion, a staggering figure for the era. His wealth didn't just buy oil rigs and drilling rights, it bought influence. Hunt became a significant political donor, funding conservative causes, anti-communist campaigns, and even covert efforts to shape public opinion during the Cold War. The money also financed a sprawling family empire, with business ventures branching into agriculture, real estate, and media. And here's where the domino effect becomes crystal clear. The wealth generated from that contract gave Hunt Oil the capital to compete with, and sometimes outmaneuver, the Seven Sisters oil majors in the global marketplace. In the 1960s and 70s, the company entered negotiations in the Middle East, Mexico, and Africa, securing deals that were often beyond the reach of smaller independents. These moves shifted the competitive landscape, forcing larger companies to respond and, in some cases, accelerating changes in how oil concessions were negotiated with producing nations. Meanwhile, Monty Kirkwood, the man on the other side of that contract, faded almost entirely from the public record. Without the revenue stream he had expected, he sold off most of his remaining leases within a few years, missing the wartime and post-war booms. His family's legal appeals ended in defeat, the courts consistently pointing back to the same immovable fact. The wording on the signed contract was clear. What makes this story so compelling is how invisible the turning point was to most of the world. The Texas oil boom had countless winners and losers, but here, the line between the two was drawn by a typographical error buried in legal jargon. If Kirkwood had noticed the mistake, or if a clerk in the lawyer's office had caught it before filing, the revenue split would have been entirely different. Hunt would still have profited, but without the same tidal wave of capital to fuel his expansion, the history of independent oil in America might have looked very different. Consider this. Without Hunt's aggressive growth, certain offshore projects in the Gulf might have been delayed or taken by different players. Internationally, the absence of Hunt's influence in negotiations could have left room for other independents to enter, possibly altering the pace at which producing countries renegotiated or nationalized their oil assets. It's even possible that the balance of U.S. domestic oil production in the mid-20th century, critical during the energy crises of the 1970s, would have shifted in ways that changed America's energy policy. And yet, all of these vast, world-spanning consequences lead back to the quiet moment when a typist, probably late in the day and thinking about getting home, wrote 1/8 of 1/8 instead of 1/8. That's the unsettling beauty of history. It's not just shaped by wars, elections, and revolutions, but by the tiny human errors that ripple outward in ways no one can predict. It also forces us to think about the systems we trust to safeguard fairness. Contracts are supposed to be clear, reviewed, and understood by both sides. But this story is a reminder that the legal system values certainty in the written word above the presumed intent, and that a single overlooked detail can tilt the scales for generations. Hunt Oil today is a global energy company with operations on multiple continents, still privately owned, still benefiting from the empire its founder built on that flawed contract. For those who know the origin story, it's an enduring case study in how fortunes are made not only through vision, risk-taking, and hard work, but sometimes through accidents of history that no one could have engineered if they tried. If this journey into how a single misplaced fraction created an oil empire has changed the way you think about the machinery of history, imagine how many other untold stories lie hidden in dusty archives and overlooked documents. Hit like, share this with someone who still thinks history is only about big battles and famous names, and subscribe to the Domino Effect, where we uncover the small hidden moments that tip the balance of the world in ways you'd never expect.